Thank you very much for coming in again. Let me start with the introduction for the podcast. Our focus would be mainly on just and sustainability transition and its relevance for Africa. To get more specific insight about South African experience, as we all know, a couple of years back, South Africa undertook a major initiative focused on renewable energy development, which brought in significant involvement of the private sector into the process. And there has been some effort that went into the overall design of the, the renewable energy development program in order to ensure some kind of justice element in the whole design and process implementation and so on. And it has been appreciated in terms of the amount of the volume of resource or financial resource it has mobilized through that system. So what are the specific lessons that African countries could take from this kind of initiatives, particularly looking at the South African Renewable Energy Development Initiative, both in terms of mobilizing capital and at the same time ensuring the justice dimension is captured in a more effective way in the overall design of the process. Mark.
Yeah, so it's important to bear in mind the material context. It didn't just happen because of good policy. So the material context is that South Africa has a fleet of coal-fired power stations that meet 86% of the country's electricity requirements. But the average age of those coal-fired power stations is 42 years. And basically, a coal-fired power plant has a dead stop at 50 years at best. So these coal-fired power stations have to be closed, but no one's going to give South Africa money to build new coal-fired power stations. And even if they did, it would take another 10 years. And we have power shortages now. Similarly with nuclear, there's talk of nuclear. It's going to take 15 years, and it's not going to make any difference to the current crisis where we are short of power now, and we have to close certain plants. So what's happened in South Africa, even though some people don't like the idea, some people in government, is that the only real option, the only way to build generation capacity quickly is through renewables, solar and wind, backed up by batteries and some gas. And so that's what's unfolded. We had a renewable energy program working via an auction mechanism where the state put out requests for proposals for large-scale, utility-scale renewable energy plants, and they built into the procurement criteria development criteria that, for example, a percentage of the assets needed to be owned by community trusts representing local communities, that a percentage of turnover needed to be invested in within a 50-mile radius of the plant. And those kinds of initiatives and also that there's a 40% of the shares of the company need to be owned by South Africans and in particular Black South Africans. So the renewable energy program has had a redistributive impact. It could be better. There could be more. More could have been done, but at least there were these kinds of criteria, including local. I didn't mention including local content criteria, that a certain components needed to be a high level of the components used to construct these power plants had to be procured locally. So that's all good news from a social justice, green industrialization perspective, and it generated over 200 billion rands worth of investment in a very, very short space of time. At the same time, the government deregulated and allowed households and businesses to respond to load shedding by putting solar on the rooftops. And there's now more solar on rooftops than in our renewables program. We have a total of about 13 gigawatts of renewables now, 7 on rooftop, 6 and a bit in the utility scale. And our total system's only 48 gigawatts. So renewables are growing very, very fast in the South African context, and it's got its own contradictions, which I don't have time to go into.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the experience from that program provides useful insights, both in terms of what could work well and what couldn't work, and what African countries need to consider in terms of developing their renewable energy resources. Now, the other major resource that we have in Africa is, as you know, the mineral resource, which includes critical minerals, which is spread across Africa. And a number of African countries have significant volume of the critical mineral resource share, even from global perspective. And unfortunately, as we indicated in the 2024 economy report, while most of the critical minerals are located within Africa, the percentage of value addition or any element of processing has not been done in Africa. I mean, most of the resource is moving out of the country. So we underlined the importance of Africa transitioning from an extractive economy to a productive economy. And this is a critical part of the just and sustainable transition that we are talking about when it comes to the African context. So from your experience and the lessons from other countries also, what are the critical issues that needs to be considered by African countries in order to make the maximum benefit out of their mineral resources in general and their critical minerals, the so-called critical minerals in particular, which are essential for the low carbon transition that is very much needed at a global level. Mark.
Well, as far as I know, there is an initiative by African countries to propose some kind of bargaining forum, like an OPEC for critical minerals. And if my information is correct, I'd strongly support an initiative like that. We've seen it work in OPEC, and there's no reason why it couldn't work for a number of African countries seeking to collaborate to negotiate collectively prices. And that's very different to what the US is doing in places like the Congo, where they're signing binational agreements, picking off individuals. You know, the company is running around Zimbabwe trying to tie up the lithium reserves. You know, so I do think we're facing the danger of cherry picking by the former colonial powers. So I mean, that's one dimension. The other dimension is, it's easy. It's all very well to kind of be critical of exporting raw materials and calling for beneficiation, especially linked to local content requirements that one can impose at a national level. But it's another thing to figure out how to make it work. And I personally, maybe you are in a different position. I personally haven't seen anything, any realistic work, published work, or even just report gray literature on what it's going to take to actually build the kinds of value chains that can result in beneficiation. It's easy to say, but it takes time, and you have to have the financial institutions in on the discussion, so that they can bring their perceptions of risk into the mix, I think this is a long-term bet, but there isn't. But the window of opportunity is short-term, and I'm
Yeah,
not sure how we square that circle. I find it very challenging to think practically about what there are a couple of examples here and there. But take lithium in Zimbabwe. I mean, what Tesla wants is just to ship gigantic quantities of lithium off elsewhere to make the batteries. And it's not making lithium batteries is not that challenging. Um, but I haven't seen anything suggesting how that could be done.
yeah, that is where the challenge is. I mean, essentially, when it comes to making declarations and passing decisions, Africa does not lack this kind of initiatives being declared and so on. As we have been recently hearing about putting moratorium on banning exporting any mineral resource raw out of Africa and so on. But when it comes to its practicality, we are starting from the wrong end. Essentially, to have those kind of developments, you need to have the infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, it starts with the physical infrastructure, institutional, human infrastructure, and the financial infrastructure. So we need to work that properly in such a way that it should be realistic to initiate an activity, whether it is a country-based or multiple country-based. There has been an initiative led by UNECA in recent years, which aimed at uh, transforming some of the resource from DRC to a higher value product that could be sold in the global market through a collaborative effort of a couple of countries around DRC. So getting that right is always the challenging part. But essentially, it all boils down to the individual inertia related to more the conventional approach rather than thinking about more transformational approach and laying the foundation for whatever actions that needs to be taken by African countries. So these are all the challenges that we all need to address, and essentially this is where leadership is required by some of the major regional institutions, starting from the African Union Commission, UNECA, African Development Bank, and other financing institutions and technical institutions also need to come together in order to consolidate our thinking and come up with a more workable plan to move to the next stage. I think the overall consensus now is Africa has to move to that direction, but the how part is still something that needs to be worked out. In that regard, what do you foresee in terms of the role of the leading banks in Africa, such as the Development Bank of South Africa and other regional development banks, East African development banks. There is one in ECOWAS in West Africa also. What kind of role could these financing institutions, together with the regional communities, play in terms of consolidating this kind of concrete action plan to move forward?
Yeah, I think that the DFIs on the African continent are the sleeping giant. I think they could play a much more meaningful role. So I think the African Development Bank, the African Finance Corporation, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and what's it called? That Tanzanian bank, forgotten. They're all playing like really significant sub-regional and even regional roles. I mean, DBSA, African Finance Corporation, African Development, all have involvements across Africa. But what really matters is the middle level. Not I think the bottom level are going to take a long time to strengthen, but the middle level could easily strengthen their balance sheets, expand their staff, and become a lot more intelligent when it comes to project initiation, origination, project development, project preparation, and also data transparency. There's a lot of suspicion amongst international investors and lenders and grant makers about African data, which they don't trust. So I think those institutions, all of those institutions, could shift from being lenders of last resort to lenders of first resort, where they become lead arrangers of new, creative, blended finance solutions that mobilize international capital, local domestic capital, and what's available within government sources to initiate a new generation of projects that are impactful, inclusive, and catalyze value chains, backward and forward value chains within the domestic economies.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I think we have been dealing with the major socio-economic and socio-ecological challenge in that we have both at the global and continental level for the last couple of decades. And now we are entering a new sphere where the introduction of these disruptive technologies is coming with a different kind of complexity. Now, the challenge we are facing today are of quite different nature compared to what we used to have over the last couple of decades. And Africa could be on the receiving end if it doesn't prepare itself for this coming change. And in that regard, what should African countries need to consider, and what could be the role of particularly universities and research institutions, innovation centers, when it comes to preparing Africa for this coming change, which is inevitable. It is already on our doorstep. What is your opinion about this coming complexity associated with disruptive technologies, and how are we going to deal with that in order to reduce its adverse impact and possibly maximize the benefit that could come to African countries? Mark.
Yeah, I mean, there's many complexities there, but I mean, with the AI revolution unfolding, Africa is just going to be sucked in as a technology taker, and that's going to be costly. So just to take one example, the cloud. So everybody thinks Amazon is a bookshop. It's Amazon is an algorithm, the AWS, Amazon Worldwide Services, which basically runs the cloud. So every time we click and we put something in the cloud, we are transferring cash out of our economies. And the Chinese were aware of the need to correlate their financial systems and their IT infrastructures and the cloud infrastructures very early on, and cleverly have ring-fenced all of that in a nationalist economic project. We could have an African cloud. It wouldn't be difficult to agree on that and put the architecture together, which means all our currencies are circulating locally. We're not paying in dollars every time we click to use the cloud, in the same way that every time we buy petrol, we're putting dollars into the US economy. So we have to move away from cloud dollars, cloud dollarization of our cyberspace, and create our own African cloud. So that would be a big vision, big challenge. When it comes to our knowledge institutions, our universities, our consultancies, our NGOs, I think we have an extraordinarily rich body of intellectual knowledge in those institutions, which is not fully utilized, and it's poorly networked. There's lots of siloization of projects and disciplines and institutions, and we need massive investments in the building of networks of collaborations. And I think probably maybe at the center of that is a need to develop a truly African theory of innovation. I'm not sure that the European conception of innovation is applicable in the African context. I mean, the European theory of innovation is that it's a very purposive, very constructed, very technocratic, highly institutionalized set of activities and relations. Innovation is the way Africans survive. To survive the African city, you have to continuously learn, unlearn, and relearn in a blink of an eye. Innovation is a way of life in the African context, and I think we have to tap into that energy and figure out, what's going on there. Where does this adaptability, this agility, this remarkable capacity to be chameleons and adapt to the context and the environment quickly, and that's really what could feed into an African theory of innovation. And that might be a kind of unifying narrative to bring networks together.
Yeah, that is one of the issues that I reflected in my most recent podcast related to technology and transformational leapfrogging, which I have been advocating for years. I mean, Africans need to move away from blind leapfrogging or incidental leapfrogging that is imposed on them and adapt transformational leapfrogging that is context specific and demand driven. And
Yes.
that would require developing a context-specific innovation ecosystem, which will be at the center of the socio-technological region that we need to have in order to survive and flourish also in the emerging global complexity. So this is something I think we African intellectuals, professionals need to reflect and work more seriously about it. And one of the goal of AfroLib 21 is also to catalyze a discussion between the different players and actors so that we can move along that direction that is based on our specific context and the reality we have within the continent. And I think in that context, perhaps as one last point, we'll have other episodes with you. But for today, since you are also somewhat involved in the deliberation of the G20 process in South Africa, we wanted to bring the African agenda into the core platform of deliberation during the process and manage to generate some useful ideas and recommendations, although the subsequent host is trying to put that aside. Perhaps if you could briefly highlight on the overall process and what came out of that as a major outcome, and how can we take it to the next level? I mean, and be part of the deliberation that we need to have across the continent.
Well, I mean, the South African theme for the 2025 G20 was sustainability, equality, and solidarity. And as we know, the US didn't come, and South Africa is not invited to the next G20 by the US. So what we can expect is none of the South African agenda, which was an African agenda, will be reflected in the 2026 G20. So there'll be a massive reversal of the progress made under the Brazilian presidency and the South African presidency. And so the real question is then who is whether the G20 presidency after the US is going to pick up on the US agenda, which we all can know what to expect, or picking up on the Brazilian and South African agendas. And I think at the center, I think the most significant achievement of the South African G20 was actually to reinforce this idea of the country platforms. And those country platforms are going to get taken forward. That's the big legacy of the South African G20. A country platform hub has now been established. And that hub with funding is going to support, in particular, African countries to develop country platforms. So, so while geopolitical conflicts drain resources elsewhere, and while there's a distraction on wars in Europe and other conflicts, the Global South actually should just get on with the job of drafting country platforms, connecting them up, and figuring out how to mobilize the domestic capital to implement them. I think what we are witnessing is the collapse of a global hegemon, the US. And what we see is China emerging as the alternative global hegemon. But China doesn't have military bases. US has 80. And so the way the Chinese are going to exercise their global power is through resource flows rather than military might. And there isn't going to be the equivalent of a petrodollar. So in that kind of multipolar world, Africans have a real opportunity, and we have to read the shift and take advantage of this multipolar and hopefully multi-currency world.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark. You already touched upon the last question, which I was thinking of asking you about the African position in the emerging multipolar world. I think that we may come back to this point in another episode. I think for this episode, we very much thank you for sharing your insights and experience with our audience, and I'm sure we'll continue this discussion in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.